you very much, Gordon. Can you just confirm that you can see my screen?
We can hear you, we can see you, all is good.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for that introduction. My PhD was through the Australian Centre for Health Law Research at QUT, and I know that that's in opposition to UQ, but I cannot recommend it more highly. I found the whole experience to be just fantastic. As you've already said, my presentation will be on relational autonomy in clinical research, particularly looking at the implications for consent when you change that perspective of how you look at autonomy and how you look at respect. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples as the traditional custodians of the land from which I make this presentation. In the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connection to land, sea and community. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and I hear the statement from the heart. You've already given a pretty good rundown of my interests. Just so that people are aware, this is my current set of interests. A lot of people will know me from work that I've done for Queensland Health or from various universities or for ACT Health. I've done some time as a consultant and as a lecturer at a couple of the different universities. So a lot of people will already know me. So when it comes time to actually consider an ethics application, human research ethics committees are charged with the responsibility for considering the applications before them and to establish if they are ethically sound. In order to make these determinations, they consider a range of guidance materials, laws and regulations. They also consider societal expectations and the expectations of specific cohorts being researched and the potential impact that the research might have on their families and communities. And I take note of the previous speaker that there is nothing that was mentioned in that talk that I would disagree with in any way, shape or form. I think it's foundational to the ethical conduct of research that we treat people as human beings, not as members of a particular cohort. These expectations and norms of behaviour change over time. They change with circumstances and they change depending on the research that is being conducted and the experience of the team that is conducting the research. Ethical decision-making in clinical research is not all about what the law says is allowable. Ethical decision-making in clinical research is about assessing the impacts that the research may have, both positive and negative, and making a considered judgment on the acceptability of the conduct of that research. The purpose of the national statement is to promote the conduct of ethical research. So what does that mean? We sit on human research ethics committees, we design research that we hope is ethical, we participate in studies. What is ethically acceptable when it comes to human research? I don't intend to answer all the questions that I put to you. What I really hope is that I will be able to generate some discussion and hopefully people will go away and they will think, what is it that I do to participate or to promote human research that is conducted ethically, and whose definition of respect should we be using? Respect for people is respect for them as individuals. It requires the person seeking consent to understand them as individuals and to support them to make autonomous decisions. This is far more than meeting the minimum legal requirements that participants might sign a form and tell you that they understand it. Human research ethics committees do not meet as a legal board or tribunal. They meet to consider the ethical implications of human research applications. Contrary to popular opinion, consent is not a signed participant information and consent form. It's not merely an agreement. An opt-out option is not a consent. A one-time statement does not cover consent to be involved in research, particularly long-running research, and consent is not irrevocable. Consent is contextual. As circumstances change, so does the validity of the consent provided by participants. This includes their personal circumstances as well as research activities. And so there is an expectation that researchers should continue to ensure that their participants continue to consent to be part of the research. People are allowed to change their minds. After all, they are volunteers. So far, I've talked around the idea of autonomy. Autonomy, like respect, is one of those terms that everyone knows until they really try and define it or explain it to someone else. So now we get to the heart of this presentation. What is autonomy? If autonomy is the ability to make decisions about how one lives one's life based on one's own view of what constitutes a good life, without interference or manipulation from external sources, and relational theories and rational theories of autonomy propose autonomy as self-contained, whereas relational theories see autonomy as inseparable from history, culture, relationships, and community. If we substitute the term autonomy with the definitions that I've just read out about what rational theories are and what relational theories are, we finish up with two statements. One says, rational theories posit that the ability to make decisions about how individuals live a life without interference or manipulation from external sources is self-contained. Whereas relational theories see that the ability to make decisions about how individuals live their life without interference or manipulation from external sources is inseparable from their experiences of history, culture, relationships, and community. Let's explore that in more detail. Relational models of autonomy are the dominant, rational models of autonomy are the dominant view of what autonomy ought to be. Rational models of autonomy see people as independent, free-thinking, and that they will make rational decisions in their own self-interest. One simply needs to feed the information in the person, and they will process the information to maximize the outcomes and benefits for themselves. This is the way that most consent practices currently work in clinical research, particularly in clinical trials with long, complex, legally worded participant information and consent forms. Now, that may be true for some people. However, relational models of autonomy allow that people do not always make rational decisions. People think about how the decision might affect their families or loved ones. People think about how the decision sits with their own worldview, their history, their culture, their religion. People make decisions based on trust and whether they are scared or confused or whether they're comfortable with where they are at the moment. People make decisions based on relational best interest within the context of their circumstances at the time. A rational perspective has its foundations in the legal requirements for consent. Relational autonomy is an alternative to seeing individuals as isolated decision makers. It is a perspective that is gaining acceptance in considering consent and ethical conduct in other fields such as mental health, aged care, and family law. There is nothing within the current regulatory environment that stops researchers, HREC members, or policymakers from adopting a relational perspective. A relational perspective is relevant to a progressive, multicultural, accepting and inclusive society. Having said all that, a relational approach will not solve all the problems of assessing ethical acceptability of clinical research and suddenly make the conduct of ethical research simple. There is a time commitment to building rapport and trust between researchers, participants, and communities. This requires more resources and an understanding from research funders, universities, and communities that getting it right simply takes more time. It may be influenced by factors outside of the control of the research teams, and that engagement with participants is likely to change the research as it unfolds if it is genuine collaboration. When taking specific example of consent within research, a relational model presents clear differences. A rational model makes it easy to separate recruitment, consent, and retention activities. Consent forms and approaches become standardized and formulaic and relevant to an idealized participant. A relational model views recruitment, consent, and retention interactions as part of a continuum. They are all part of the process that informs the participant about the research. And that starts with the conceptualization of the research question as being one that is meaningful to the participant cohort, and working from there to build a research protocol that is relevant to answering that question in a respectful manner. Consent can be more easily seen as consent to participate rather than an agreement to be studied. A relational perspective to the involvement of clinicians in research acknowledges that in certain circumstances, and certainly not in all cases, the most appropriate person for a participant to discuss the implications of enrolling in a study is their physician, the person that they trust with their care and whom they turn to for advice on health matters. If consent to participate in research is to be informed, the information provided needs to be accessible, understandable, and meaningful to the participants. The information provided ought to make sense in the context of the participant's worldview. And I would particularly like to note that I am trying within the University of Canberra to promote the idea that you can use infographics and you can use diagrams in the consent form. It's just not reasonable to expect everyone to be able to read participant information that's provided at university level of English. There are broader advantages of a relational model. A relational model of research involves participants or participant representatives as appropriate in the development of research questions, methods, data collection, analysis, and interpretation. And this can lead to greater community support for the conduct of research, research addressing concerns of the community, clearer paths for research translation into practice, and increased consumer health research literacy. Because as a lot of you will know, the levels of health literacy in Australia are very low, and the levels of health research literacy are even lower. One of the strengths of the Australian research ethics environment is the continual review processes in place for the national statement. This allows us to be reflective in ensuring that guidance materials are aligned with community expectations rather than responding to crises and scandal. Change is never easy. It's even harder when there is no scandal to drive the need for change. However, just because it ain't broke doesn't mean we can't think about better ways of doing things. When it comes to ethical conduct, regulation, governance, and oversight of clinical research, I suggest that we have a moral obligation to continually improve. If not us, then who? If it's not us that have the responsibility to contribute to continuous improvement of how the research community treats participants, then where does that responsibility lay? The concept is simple. Respect people as human beings that have hopes and dreams and doubts and strengths and resilience peculiar to them. Respect them as individuals. The practice is far more complex. It requires a change of thinking, and that's never easy. I certainly don't have all the answers. However, I hope this presentation sparks a discussion about what it really means to respect another person. Thank you.
Nice work, Ian, and really enjoy the concept of relational autonomy. I guess by virtue of the fact that, at least to my mind, the national statement already facilitates this, and I'm sure many of us have either thought about or encouraged potential participants, and you mentioned these long consent forms or information sheets, to take them back to their family, doctors, whatever, to actually get input. And to me, this is a very similar sort of thing. But Lisa Eckstein is asking a very good question, which is, I'd be interested to know your view on an HREC requiring of its researchers more than the baseline of what the national statement promotes. So where's the line between promoting ethically good research and potentially seeking more? You made a really good point, and you sort of answered it to some extent by saying, I can't remember what it was, but you actually mentioned it essentially to say trying to promote something when it isn't broken. So where do you think ethics committees can go with this, and how should we address this when there's a potential for scope creep from an ethics committee, which, as we know, is always under scrutiny?
It is always under scrutiny, Gordon, and it is a great question. And I would say back to Lisa, at what point should we strive to meet the minimum standard rather than to improve? The national statement is the minimum standard, and to say, well, this research meets the national standard says, well, it meets the very barest of minimum that we should expect. And I think that every ethics committee has the right to ask for more, and certainly every university should expect more than the very basics from their researchers.
I might take it one step further than that. I mean, I don't think it's about the ethics committee. I really think it's about the participant and making them feel informed and comfortable with what they're agreeing to, as opposed to what an ethics committee thinks. I mean, this is a natural justice, potentially a human rights issue, do you not think?
Oh, absolutely. I think that if we get to the point where we're looking at participant information sheets and saying, where is the participant in this participant information sheet? How does this participant information sheet actually inform participants? There's a lot of misinformation out there, and so, like as an example, you might be doing vaccine research. Now, I think that there is an obligation on researchers to counter some of that misinformation about vaccines, because people don't come to the research naive. They're not only looking at the information that you're giving them and saying, well, yes, now I understand what it's all about. They're coming to the research with their background, with their historic background, with the way that they're, when you look at the way that Afro-Americans engage in research and you say, well, they're almost entirely unrepresented, and much of that can be attributed to the behaviour of researchers in the past. And we need to acknowledge that. If you're doing research with cohorts that are underrepresented, you need to understand why they're underrepresented and say, well, how do we, as a research community, address that history? You know, when you're doing research with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, you know, you have to consider their past. It's not just about the individual, it's about engaging with their community, with their history, with their perspective. And to say that people are participants when a participant information sheet is really addressed at an idealized person and doesn't acknowledge the individuals, I think is a misnomer.
Yeah, great point, Ian. We really do have to move on. But I think all you said is right. I still think we just need to reinforce the fact that this is the right of the participant, as opposed to something the ethics committee, should want. I mean, we should be encouraging those that do the consent. So maybe it's about changing the consent process to encourage people, to give them as many opportunities as possible to seek that, that relevant information from friends, family, whomever. Because I did slightly disagree with your point about the legal standard. I mean, valid consent is specific and informed, and if you're not specifically informed, and that could be part of the entity, then it's not valid consent.
It's also appropriately informed. It's not just specifically informed; it's appropriately informed.
Yep, no, good point.
And
if
you already have a misconception, then you're not going to be informed in an appropriate manner.
Yeah, Ian, I'm going to leave it there, and a few other members did.